we're testing. Great. We're all good. Close the door too. Thanks. All right, I think we're ready to get started. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Great. Well, thank you so much for being here and for sticking around on the last day, especially after those amazing plenaries. I was very inspired. So this session really, tries to capture some of the elements that we've been talking about all of the conference, addressing the challenges and opportunities in the native seed supply chain. And I just want to thank Nancy Shaw and Leah Prescott. Leah couldn't be here for helping me organize the session. So as you all know, the need for restoration is increasing. We're facing dual crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. Oh, sorry. This is such an awkward placement. Thank you. What that means is we need more seed. The UN estimates that we'll need to restore 3.36 billion acres by 2030. And that means we'll need close to 2 billion tons of native seed. And this need for seed is increasingly being recognized, and it's increasingly being recognized across sectors, both, of course, in the native seed sector, as well as in forestry. And this means that there's more awareness and there's more strategic guidance and hopefully funding to try to cultivate the seed that we need to achieve these restoration goals. Of course, the availability of native seed is highly reliant on a robust and functional seed supply chain that is well integrated and functions accordingly. So if you had the chance to attend the film yesterday, you probably know some of the steps of the native seed supply chain, but typically they start with the planning and sourcing, wild collection followed by seed increase in most cases, cleaning, quality testing, and sometimes certification, storage, seed treatments and technologies, and finally seeding. And not only do these elements have to work together, they also have to be supported by funding, by policies that promote cooperation and access to all the steps and expertise along the supply chain. And we also need the people and the know-how to make all of these elements function well together. So I'm really excited for today's panel because we have experts from around the country that work with some element or maybe all elements of the native seed supply chain. And of course, we all know that the way that supply chains function and the associated challenges and opportunities are different across the country. And those differences are primarily dependent on where you are. In the West, where you have the majority of land that's managed by the federal government, federal agencies typically drive some of the big picture opportunities and challenges that exist. In the East, where the majority of the land is privately or state managed, you have different challenges. But regardless of where you are in the country, what they all share, or what all supply chains share, is the fact that they have to function across a matrix of jurisdictional and institutional boundaries. So we all have to work with each other to figure out a way to get more seed to these restoration sites. And so I'm hoping that in today's panel, we have the opportunity to learn from each other and to understand how different parts of the country address some of these challenges. I also hope that, having attended this meeting, hopefully having read the NASEM report and other documents that have been released in the last several years, we all can kind of start at a place that dives a little bit deeper than just the superficial. So we already know that seed markets in the Western United States are primarily driven by federal agency actions, while issues affecting the Midwest and urban areas, as well as the East, are primarily driven by state actions and are somewhat distinct. We also know that the availability of genetically appropriate seed is limited in many regions, and this is primarily the case for a lot of forb species and sometimes shrubs. If there's any growers in the room, I don't have to tell you that seed production is financially risky and requires a lot of know-how and therefore financial support upfront. Procurement may be still hampered by market volatility, and that's related to demand and supply. And seed markets may be strongly affected by limited botanical capacity. Kay and Beth touched on this morning, that we really need both the human and the physical infrastructure to support the seed supply chain. And finally, there's a need for cross-disciplinary research to answer some of our basic applied questions that we have across the entire seed supply chain. So the moral of the story is that we need to stabilize demand, increase supply and capacity, and work together. So with that, I would like to introduce our amazing panel, and I'll just do a quick bio for everyone, and if I call your name, just wave so folks know who you are. And I'm sorry, I'm like awkwardly, maybe I'll stand here. So we have, our first panelist is Dr. Kevin Badik, who is an ecologist with the Nature Conservancy in Nevada. And he works on ways to improve restoration through better practices of increasing the availability of native seed in the right place. Our next panelist is at the other end of the table. Dr. Marcello de Vitis is the director of Southeast Native Seed Program, based at the Southeastern Grasslands Institute at Austin Peay State University in Clarksville, Tennessee, where he's been developing and directing the native seed program that has a regional reach of 10 states. And prior to this, Marcello has 15 years of research experience in plant conservation and seed biology spanning Italy, the UK, and the US. Our next panelist is Dr. Alison Agneray. This is like a trading chairs situation. Dr. Alison Agneray is a Great Basin Ecoregional Coordinator for the Bureau of Land Management based in Reno, Nevada, and she works to improve the access and use of native plant materials for restoration work being performed across 5 states in the semi-arid Great Basin. Our next panelist is Tony Falk, who is the Dan L. Duncan, Director of Texas Native Seeds at Texas A&M in Kingsville. And Dr. Falk has worked for 12 years with a program that has helped develop 15 locally adapted native seed varieties that are all commercially available today. Michael Bouck is the Certified Seed Program Manager for Utah Crop Improvement Association at Utah State University in Logan, Utah. And Michael manages the seed certification program for the state of Utah, which is a unique job due to the amount of wildland collected seed there. He enjoys working with wildland seed companies and the challenges that wildland collected and non-traditional seeds provide. Ed Toth is the director of Mid-Atlantic Regional Seed Bank in New York, and Ed has been a member of the National Academy of Science Committee on the assessment of the needs for native seed and capacity for their supply that you've heard about a lot during this conference. And Ed's been involved in native plant material development in one capacity or another for the last 40 years. Our next panelist is Owen Baughman, who is a restoration scientist for the Nature Conservancy based in Burns, Oregon. And Owen's been involved in dryland plant ecology and restoration across the western United States for the last 15 years. And finally, Katie VinZant, who is a restoration biologist with the Native Park Service working across the United States. So with that, just wanted to go over some quick housekeeping items. So we'll have 40 minutes for pre-curated questions that we've come up with for our speakers. And then we have 20 minutes for questions for the audience. Technically, the organizers gave us 2 hours, so if you guys are full of questions and our panelists are open to it, we can keep going. But just for, to set the bar relatively low. Yes, we can provide snacks. So during the questions from the audience portion of this, just please raise your hand and Nancy or I will come around with a microphone, or we could just repeat the question, whatever's easiest. And then if you do ask a question, we'll just make sure that it's repeated so that the recording can pick it up. And with that, I'll move on to our pre-curated questions. So this one I would like to have all of the panelists answer, which is, what do you see as the biggest challenge to the current seed supply chain in the region or the place in the supply chain that you work? And maybe we'll start with Marcello and we'll go down the line.
Right. Shall I take the microphone or? Yes. Okay.
So voice at the time, just make sure both of them are on.
Okay, there it goes. No, I'm stepping on it. All right, can you hear me? No.
Are you good?
Switch, maybe. Oh, sorry. There you go, pull on it. You got more cord.
Hi, can you hear me? Is that working? Okay, hi everyone. Okay, so I would like to start with a couple of comments. First of all, I'm trying to represent the region where I work, the Southeast US, because obviously it's not just my perspective. I tried, knowing that I was coming to be part of this panel, I kind of surveyed quickly collaborators and partners. Everyone is very busy, but I got some great responses because I'm trying to, again, represent not just my perspective, but a collaborative, participatory idea. And so also when I knew that it was going to be challenges and opportunities, I sat down and thought, okay, list challenges, opportunities. And I had one challenge and 15 opportunities. Maybe it was a very positive day. I was very optimistic that day. But also because I think that every challenge can turn into an opportunity. But then I also thought, okay, an opportunity maybe is something that we can solve pretty quickly. Maybe a challenge is not something that we can fix so quickly. So let me move something under the challenge list. But anyway, I think if I have to mention maybe a top challenge in our region, it could be there are not as many growers. There are a few seed producers and a few nurseries, but not as many. In some states, there are no growers at all. And so one thing that we're trying to work all together is to engage with farmers that might want to start working with native seeds. But again, why it's not, it could be an opportunity, right? More growers, and we increase the seed supply chain or the supply for the seed supply. It's more a little bit of a challenge. I don't want to be negative, but that just because that's not going to happen overnight. It's going to be engaging. Who is on board? Who wants to do that? And training, finding a system on how to support these new farmers into this journey, which is we know it's not super easy, or if you're switching between traditional agriculture to native crops, can be a little challenging. So, but I think it could be a bottleneck in our region, the number of growers that are currently supplying eco-regional native seed. Yeah.
Awesome. First, I want to say that I feel very humbled to be up here. There's a lot of expertise sitting here, and I'm terrified I'm going second here because I think I'm about to say things that people here are going to say a lot better. So I'll try to keep it short. But I have a very Western perspective. This is my first time to DC, and I don't come east very often. So this is a very Western perspective I have on seed, and a pretty young perspective as well. Not too far into my career, but I wanted to say that I sat down and thought about the barriers that I see, and I was very happy to see that they're very, very well articulated in the National Academy's report. And so I won't go into too much detail, but hopefully try to put it in slightly different words that incentivized production of seeds seems like a place that has gotten better, but we can go a lot better there. We need to make it really worth it to get into growing native seeds because there's a lot of risk there, and I think to do that we also need more predictive demand and purchasing from the largest purchasers, which is obviously the BLM and some of the agencies, and it just that's in there. It's planning that out pretty far in advance will really help all of this. And I'm not an economist, so I tend to look at that and be like, I think I understand how this works. But that's in there, and lots of smart people said that's a real big recommendation. So, but I want to flip the question just a little bit to say that things I don't think are barriers, if we can get this right, which is that I'm always amazed. I'm not a farmer, and I want to be, but I have nothing in that department in my skill set. But I'm always amazed at the crazy farm machinery there is out there to do the weirdest little tasks on fields. And so I think if we can make it worth it to grow these plants and put a little bit of security into doing this and take some of the risk out, I'm not worried that these crazy farmers with all their welding barns and all this crazy equipment, they're going to figure out how to do weird stuff that we can't even imagine right now to grow these plants that are hard, and it is hard, but I think they like coming up with new solutions to problems. We just need to make it worth it. And so and I think the National Academy's report really identifies how to make this market a market that is going to allow for that kind of ingenuity. So I'm not worried about that. And I'm also, this is going to sound a little weird because I am a scientist, but I think there's a knowledge gap. That is a major barrier. We don't know some really important things about plants that we really want to, but we have a lot of knowledge. And there's a lot of knowledge that we already have out there that is not, because everybody's in a triage mode, especially in the West, that is not hitting the ground yet. And so we have enough knowledge to do better today. We still need more knowledge to do better in the future. But we need a lot of science translation and cross-jurisdictional coordination. So I'll leave it at that.
I'm going to kind of jump ship here a little bit and take a different direction on this question, but I just spent 3 years of my life on a committee looking at this in a way that I'm from the urban East. I ran a native plant nursery for 25 years for the city of New York. I also have the unique perspective of doing everything but putting the plants out there, but collecting seed, processing it, banking it, growing it, increasing it. We did all that in, believe it or not, New York City for 25 years. So part of my voice on the committee was for the urban East and the East in general. But I think in general, I don't know how well it's been driven home, but we are at an amazing moment of opportunity here. There are hundreds of millions of dollars that are about to be spent and are being spent. And the promise of the work of this, first of all, there are 500 people at this conference. We need 500 lobbyists to go out there, as Peggy Olwell briefly said yesterday, to take this study, this National Academy of Science study, and put it in front of your representatives and push to see that this money is wisely spent, because it's a lot of money. It's more money than most of us have ever seen going into this effort, and it ain't going to stay around, and there's no guarantee when more of it's going to come around at this scale. So you all need to go back wherever you come from, and if you don't know who your senators and your representatives are, you need to find out very quickly, and you need to put the National Academy of Science studies in their hands, and you need to tell them that they need to get this right. The promise of this study was that the federal agencies would get their act together and learn to talk to each other and communicate and come up with a national approach to all of this, but that national approach would be regionalized, that the expertise is there. So I'm from the Mid-Atlantic. I desperately need the funds to build a program. The real driver, the real enabler of that is this huge pot of money that's out there right now. So every one of us has huge needs. We're all talking about it. This is the opportunity to birth a system of regional programs that not only address the West, but address every region of the country equitably, and are not just, it's really hard for me to go out there and to have to, coming from the urban East, where 4% of the land is federal, to have to tailor my asks for funding based on the fact that I do or do not have a national forest in my region, or an Air Force base, or heaven forbid a BLM lighthouse, which is my only opportunity to tap into BLM funding in the East. The promise is that we are going to roll out equitably regional programs across the United States to meet this challenge. And that's what you need to go back wherever you're from and talk to your representatives and see that that's what's happening to this funding, that it's not going into the department, the USDA or the Department of Interior or any one of those groups, and not bringing forth that promise of regionalized programs, because that's going to fuel everything that everyone at this table is going to talk about is their challenges and their opportunities. And it's of the moment, so we shouldn't squander this moment. Thank you.
So I actually got introduced twice. I am the crazy farmer here. And when I get home, I'm going to pull out the welder, and well, I actually did. But I think I could answer the question with one word, and that is demand. And it's been brought up in other meetings. One of the ways that we've dealt with this in Utah is through the Watershed Restoration Initiative. And it has been a wonderful program that has helped our rangelands there, and I'd like to share some numbers later on, but and Kevin in the back of the room here can answer a lot more questions than I can, but our seed companies and our seed growers all deal with this challenge of having a consistent demand for their seed, and they are doing the best they can to guess what seed is needed. But if you just tell them what they need or what you need, they'll go get it. And if we can help smooth out that demand, it's going to make the seed a lot more economic to go out and buy, and you can use the funds in your program to accomplish a lot more. And these guys, they all work together. They specialize in one thing, but they know each other's phone numbers, and they work together. And it's a good example, even within the what we call the WRI, or the Watershed Restoration Initiative. It's a cooperative that came together over a number of years, from a lot of different agencies and private companies, just working together and becoming a program that hasn't been there all that long, but it has accomplished much. And I say hasn't been there all that long officially, but they've been around doing it for a long time. So with that, I'll pass the mic on.
Is this on? Yes. Well, damn, everybody already said what I was going to say. What the heck? And probably a lot more eloquently than I was going to say it, so thank you. So I think working for the Park Service, I think one of the challenges that we see across the board is being able to find eco-regionally and elevation-appropriate seed. We're very concerned, obviously, working for the Park Service to keep that genetic, the genetics across the board for our parks, that we are considering genetic appropriateness and adaptation for the parks that can change across the Park Service in many different ways. So we can have parks that are more quote unquote pristine, that maybe we have a smaller tolerance for taking genetic stock from various locations, and we have parks that are surrounded by urban areas, and maybe we have a higher tolerance for taking genetically different stock. But that is something that we come across all the time as a challenge. You talked about consistency. That I can see is one thing that the farmers get really frustrated with us about, is that we don't have a consistent need, and a lot of times we don't have great predictions on what we're going to need in the future, and that's something that we really need to work on, is coming up with what our needs are in the long term. Another problem that we have is finding small-scale growers. A lot of times we may not have the funding to do large-scale, and by large-scale I mean like 1 acre of seed grow out. So if we're really trying to propagate and fund small growers to help us with like little 1/10 of an acre plots that would really get us started, and amplification of seed. And that's enough talking for me.
Thanks, Katie. So I'm here to represent sort of from the Bureau of Land Management, but there are others in this room who have been doing this a whole lot longer than I have, so I'm glad that you're here too. Speaking for the Bureau, the number one challenge we have right now is capacity, like just human infrastructure. As one example, in Nevada, there are 2 people who are dedicated to thinking about plants for their job, and I'm one of them. And we manage almost 80% of the landmass of Nevada, and all of that land has plants on it, and there's only 2 people thinking about them on a full-time basis. So what that means is we're still thinking about plants, but those folks who are doing it are fire ecologists, wildlife bios, rec people who just happen to enjoy plants and have taken on this beautiful word I've learned of collateral duties, where they are just happening to think about plants because they like them or have been mandated by their supervisor. So we don't have folks in these positions. So if you don't have people to ask for seed and, think about seed, it's really hard for us to stabilize demand if those people just aren't there. And we're working on that and trying to build. And I'm still fairly new to the federal government, but the hiring process is challenging and it takes a very long time. So that's probably the number one challenge we have, is that human sort of infrastructure in our state. Also physical infrastructure, where we don't have, we already purchase quite a bit of seed, but are, maintaining the warehouse, having places to store seed, clean it, all of that has been really challenging for us. But there are opportunities, but I know that's a next question. The other thing is we work on these really short planning horizons, and the way that our budget cycle sort of works, it makes it incredibly challenging to plan really far in advance and kind of complete all the NEPA required to do these projects. All of that's really challenging, especially if you don't have people willing or, there to work on it. Also, just the massive scale of that we're talking about. I love seeing these really lovely projects that are 5 acres or less. And, the smallest project I've seen where people are talking about seed is like 2,000 acres. It's like, wow, that's considered, really pretty small for us. So that the scale of these projects is just almost overwhelming sometimes. That's enough. I could keep going, but there's a lot of challenges. No, you're good. You're good. I was not feeling as optimistic as Marcello when I wrote down my list. So, thank you.
So I've got a bit of a different perspective, coming from a state that doesn't really fall into the east or the west. We've got a climate that's very western, but yet privately owned. So, and our program is very goal-driven. So one of the big things that I see as a challenge is the difference between dreams and realities. We can all hope and we can all dream that we want that native plant or that entire native community from our backyard that's going to be commercially available. The reality is that the manpower is not going to be there. That's not a big enough market. Again, market size is one of those things that we think our project is enough to make some of these big commercial growers go out and put in hundreds of thousands of acres worth of that individual release. And again, that's just not the reality of the situation. So getting people in general to realize that what is physically capable at that time or in the future versus what they dream about. And then the other thing is getting people to broaden their horizons of working with other folks. We work with a number of oil and gas operators, private landowners, and across the board. They're two very different mindsets, but they're all after the same goal. And so having people realize that what works in one region or on one project can work in another project, or what works on small scale can work on big scale, or vice versa, and getting people to just broaden their ideas of what's possible, and not being so closed-minded about, hey, this is how I have to do it because this is who I work for and the way it has to be.
I wasn't sure when Olga started. I was like, do I want to be first or do I want to be last? I know I'm not going to be in the middle. So I want to add, so I'm based in Nevada. I'm a little different because I'm like I started in Beth's lab, but I was like the stepchild of the lab, and I was off doing my wildfire thing, and all these other people, a lovingly accepted stepchild, but one nonetheless. But all these other people were doing all these sweet seed restoration stuff, and I was like, hey, can I burn some needles somewhere? And then I kind of came back around, and so I have a little bit different perspective, is that I often work in kind of these modeling frameworks and kind of convening these bigger and different perspectives together. And so hearing everyone, the thing that I thought was the barrier, one of the things I thought was a barrier that hadn't been mentioned, is I'm going to change the right seed to, I think we often don't have the right conversation at the right place at the right time. And so oftentimes I'll hear from growers or other people that we can't grow this particular seed. And I want to agree with that, but I always want to say, if you tell, I'm kind of getting to the point, and maybe I'm getting old enough or gray enough and just like not caring as much, or I don't know, where it's like, if you tell me a barrier, I want to know what that barrier is. Is it because you can't clean it? Is it because you can't harvest it? Is it because you can't collect it? But we need to identify those solutions. So we need to have those conversations about what are the actual barriers. When we talk about demand, I fully recognize we're talking about it in an economic sense, but I can tell you the demand is big. But when we need to have better conversations about what those demands are. We've done a little bit of work with some help from the BLM and some partners around Carson City to try to estimate what our demand is for the next 10 years. But we have scientific tools. We have ability to forecast into the future about what these things are. So I think sometimes it's all of us making sure that the right people are in the room, and that we're having those conversations, and that we're having maybe the hard conversation too, to make sure that we can all get on the same page and all talk to each other in a way that pushes us forward.
Speak to opportunities because, this just showed up, because some folks already mentioned it, but if there are things that are, burning in your mind that you want to mention right now, maybe 3 people from the panel could speak up.
One thing that I can say as an opportunity is the energy around this topic, and also the age range of folks that are interested in this topic. You go to an SRM meeting and very few people in those meetings still have color in their hair, unless they put it there themselves. And it's just a different mindset, and they struggle with how to get people into that room and how to get people to those meetings. This meeting is the other side of that, and so there's all of this opportunity available to get a group of people who are eager and hunger to make a change, to look at things from a different point of view, and have the energy to go out and put a whole career into making a change.
So something that I'm really excited about is the synergy that I see going on between the agencies, that we're working more closely with BLM, with Fish and Wildlife Service. It's going beyond the Department of Interior. It's the USDA is getting involved. And I think we really I see that moving forward, that we are going to have a lot more collaboration moving forward. Anna puts up with me calling her all the time. Folks are very enthusiastic to share their knowledge, to work across boundaries, even when it means lots and lots of paperwork. And I think we're trying to find those creative ways to streamline things to move forward more quickly.
So I'm turning something that I've heard being a challenge into an opportunity, because I have to be the over-optimistic of the panel. But I think conversation and seed planning, it's an opportunity because I can see that happening in a short time. So one thing that I will do going back home after this amazing conference is actually bringing people together, because I know that for growers it's very difficult not knowing much in advance what to grow, and so having a conversation with the big seed buyers, especially for some ecotypes that take longer to grow or are not economically viable to grow constantly, they need to know that in advance, and so there must be a dialogue. And I know in some other regions, this dialogue there is a good structure to have these meetings or forum, whatever they're called, to sit down together and make the seed planning together. And I see this as an opportunity at least for the region that I'm representing. So this is something I'm gonna go home and work on, to bring everything together around the table.
I appreciate your optimism. So for the next question, we're really just interested to learn more about the recent advances or successes, again, continuing on the optimistic train here, in people's regions. And I was wondering if we can ask Katie, Marcello, and Michael to speak to that. And you can, Katie, maybe you can start? Sure.
So I think one thing that we're seeing that I consider a great success is we're internally across the Park Service. I just spoke about how it used to be very looking within only a park's boundaries. We're now starting to work across parks, trying to talk about seed transfer zones. What is an appropriate seed transfer zone? That concept really wasn't happening in the past. And looking at ways to, again, become more efficient about where can we share seed, not only within our own boundaries, but as I was talking about with Forest Service, our neighbors, or whether it's TNC or whoever it is, who can we share with so that we can make our dollar go further? I think that's one of the greatest successes that we're starting to see move forward.
So it's on, right? So I mentioned the WRI, and I just want to throw some numbers out here that, well, I should back up and give some brief history. It started out as a problem in the 50s and 60s, and basically came from sheep ranching, which is still there, but they had the problem of overgrazed lands, and the sheep ranchers came together with state agencies and federal agencies and came up with a solution that was really just a bunch of guys working together, and eventually became what is now known as the Restoration or Watershed Restoration Initiative, which was formally formed in 2006. And in that time, they've done about 2,600 projects, 2.4 million acres, 349 million in funding, and 40 million in kind, which it was really quite amazing since 2006 and accomplishing that much. And if you compare it to the numbers that we're hearing from the seed supply report, at 3.3 million acres and 2 billion tons of seed, I think that's something that's doable. And so I think that the important thing is to not reinvent the wheel. Somebody's already figured that out. Go to your state agencies and your landowners and work with them on forming a similar type of a cooperative that will help to mitigate some of the problems and bring them to the forefront so that you have a solution that will work. And what kind of became of this is these guys that started out working at the Great Basin Regional Warehouse. Long time ago, they were employees there, and then they were working out a way to go back and restore some of this land, and they said, well, we need some seed, and so they went and collected it, and eventually that became a seed company, and then it became another guy's seed company. And that's really what we have in Utah, is that there are a lot of different seed companies that go out and wild collect seed and sell it to these different agencies so that they can use it for their projects. And then eventually became a program that was doing some proactive reclamation. And so I think that we've taken a challenge and we've turned it into an opportunity and a benefit for this program. So I would say that just taking that opportunity and modeling it after something that works has been a real good benefit for what we have there in Utah.
I think so. The Southeast Native Seed Program is very young. We started only a year ago, but I think one of the so it's a little early to say, successes or failures. It's a little early, but I think one thing that I count as a success is the participation that I am seeing in the region. Like a lot of great partners and collaborators that have like a lot of complementary expertise, and they are on board, and they're like, yes, this is what we need, and we are on board. Let's do it together. And this collaboration instead of competition, I think is a big success. And I'm very optimistic again that it's gonna really be an important element for moving on and the development of this program. Yeah.
So the next question I'd like to ask Ed, Katie, and Alison to address. And this one, sorry, it's going backwards. Obviously climate change is presenting new challenges, and we have to make decisions quickly. So in your minds, what are the key considerations and changes needed to respond to issues created by climate change with respect to this native seed industry? You can go in, that's probably best.
So in terms of thinking about sort of what do we need to start planning for with climate change, speaking for the Great Basin, the number one thing I'm seeing is we need more plant materials that are adapted and appropriate for these drier portions of our region, especially if the Mojave sort of climbs northward. A lot of the materials we have available right now are from more northern reaches of the Great Basin or northern reaches of the West, and they just really aren't doing well when we try to use them in the lower parts of the region. We're also seeing fire and precipitation patterns changing dramatically. So we keep saying, oh, but they work if it's a good year, but the last good year was 5-6 years ago. Like, we can't just wait for that. So we either need to find a way to water the desert, or we need to find ways to get more adapted materials available at the scales we need them. But again, we need folks to also ask for those materials. So it's a complicated problem. But those are the things I really think about with climate change.
So I would echo what Alison just said, that we really would like to see more focus on a collection of more genetic data to inform empirical seed transfer zones that can then be overlaid with climate change models, and really to figure out where our vulnerable areas are and then focus our seed collection and our seed production on those particular areas. That goes hand in hand with looking at fire frequency. We kind of know areas that are more prevalent, or seeing repeated fire, and going after collection in those areas. We need to find ways to prioritize to move forward with the limited funding that we have.
Yeah, I would pretty much echo that. I think we need to be able to move past predictive models, some of which are continental scale, some of which are landscape scale, but we need real-time data. And so I think, again, as we build regional networks, and Francis Kilkenny asked about this morning, we need to be building in the researchers and the land-based partners around the region to do real-time data collection to inform us about how species are moving, and to move beyond these predictive models and to start to be able to work off of real data in our individual regions.
So one more pre-curated question, and then we'll open it up to you all to ask our panelists some questions. Just wanted to put it out to maybe Tony and Marcello and Owen, if you'd like to chime in. Who do you think, in terms of partners or industries, are we missing in this conversation? Obviously, we've discussed that it's going to take all of us to work together to make this work. So, are there any entities that are coming to mind with this question?
Some that we've had good success with, but I don't know how many of them are actually represented at meetings like this, are your for-profit end users. Oil and gas industry does a ton of restoration work, and there's a big push with these ESG scores that a bunch of those folks are starting to toe the line. They just need that added push, but they don't know what they're asking for. A lot of these folks are engineers. So getting those folks in the room so they can understand. Another one that has reliable in and out demand our highway departments. Those are folks that plan years in advance, manage thousands of acres of rights of way in all of our regions that we work in. And, getting those folks on board. And again, it's a group of engineers. They may have a slight interest in vegetation, but it's the engineering community. The seed producers are fairly well represented here, this week, and that's good to get them involved. But I was in a panel earlier that asked how many people have visited their local seed producer, and I bet fewer of the seed producers would raise their hand if you've asked them how many have visited your sites where you're doing collections, or if you're a seed developer, looked at what you're using to develop seed. So that conversation starting, but filling it in. So I think there's two kind of big groups of folks that we're missing right now.
Yeah, here's a group nobody thinks about, although there was one person here that I know of, and that's procurement officials. There are so many barriers thrown up by not just federal agencies, state agencies, even municipal agencies, both to the access of seed collection, but also how we can use that seed. If we're getting it off of a state parkland, can we use it in other? So we have a whole world of procurement officers and policies that are very entrenched, and a lot of them are not, they're people who've dealt with plumbing supplies and electrical, they come from a very wide world of procurement, but they're not particularly in tune to the notion of dealing with live plants and the realities of all that, and what barriers we need to throw down, what bridges we need to build so that we can do a better job of what we want to do. So I tried to get somebody it turns out there's a couple National Association of Procurement Officers that tried to get them to testify in front of the National Academy Committee, and they kind of looked at me like I had three heads, but I think it's something that we really need to work at.
You want to go first?
I just wanted to quickly reiterate the highway departments. I don't have a lot of experience with that, but it is a lot of area, even in the West where there doesn't seem like there's a lot of roads. And they do a lot of roadside stuff that can be really important for, fuel mitigation and stuff. And I saw a poster that I forget who was involved, Conference Brain, but they were in South Dakota and they were looking at how many collections are there, and then looking over at Iowa, and Iowa had all these collections, and it was like, why? And it was in a grid. It was like, why are there all these collections for all these zones in Iowa? It's because, the highway department mandated that they should have zones, collections for all the zones or something like that. I'm getting the details wrong, but it was like, here's the power of that involving that group. And so I think I would love to see more of that. I don't know what it looks like, but.
First of all, I'm representing a region with several states, and each state might have very specific gaps or challenges, but kind of sort of connected to my two previous answers. Growers and maybe regional representatives of the main agencies who are the seed buyers that can sit down and with buyers and other key stakeholders and make this planning together for seed needs. And maybe also what I'm probably observing is a little bit of lack of research that specifically is intended to help improving and advancing the technology in seed production specifically in our region.
So now it's time for all of your questions, and I just ask that you keep your questions brief so we can get through a bunch of them. So go ahead.
I think I was just kind of, I don't know if I have a question or maybe a comment, but that last question that you asked about partners and other ways to collaborate. I've managed a seed lab, and I haven't heard a whole lot of talk at this meeting this week about seed testing, and it's a big part of the movement of seed. We could also probably use some of that, all that goody money that's supposed to be coming, and might help support some state seed labs with equipment and stuff, because testing native seeds is very difficult. A lot of seed analysts across the country, learned on corn, or wheat or something like that, and then they get these crazy things thrown at them that take a lot of time and a lot of knowledge. There's a few seed labs across the country like ours and some others that have kind of jumped into native seed testing and try to get good at it. But I think maybe there could be some education there on the land manager's end about how to read a seed label, how the tests are done, what it means, the seed law, seed certification, all of that. Maybe the next meeting we have some of these kinds of things go on with seed testing, so people can watch that if they want to.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to reiterate the comment just so in case folks didn't hear. The comment is really, we should also be talking to seed analysts and seed testing labs, because it's such an integral part of the, getting the right seed in the right place, right? We have to know where it's coming from, what its quality is. And I wonder if, Michael, you have anything to say about sort of source-identified seed or testing in general?
Randy brings up a good point there. And within the seed certification program, we're all different, but we're all the same. And in that we have these seed testing and requirements that we meet in order for them to be certified. And the more that the seed departs from kind of an agricultural crop to one that little is known about, the harder those seed testing rules get. And especially if they become more and more, the standard is more and more less pure seed. And like with sagebrush, for example, the standard is kind of around 50%. And that's kind of, what is not just acceptable, but what is wanted when you're planting sagebrush. And you get that a lot of variation with a lower seed purity percentage. And sure, they can go in and they can find the weeds and all that kind of stuff, but having the purity standards and the germination standards are the really challenging things that the guys in the seed lab just have to have lots of experience, and you have to kind of build that, because it becomes subjective in all that you do there. So
yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Yeah, in the back.
Yeah, first, I'll admit that I missed the first couple of questions, so
it's okay.
Disregard this was covered earlier. Talked about this late. So one of the larger presences on the demand side, accepting the federal land management agencies, might be the Conservation Reserve Program. And I was wondering if any of the panelists or the folks in the audience have any thoughts about policy recommendations and pointing fingers to particular barriers associated with that program in terms of providing livelihoods to the suppliers as well as just getting the right stuff on the ground.
Go ahead. And could you repeat the question or summarize it? Thank you.
So the question was kind of framed with the large federal agencies are a big driver of demand, but another driver is the CRP program or Conservation Reserve Program, and what are some challenges in utilization of that program or getting the right seed down. One of the issues that we're dealing with is getting the newest seed releases that we work on the list to be able to be planted in that program. Even though we do co-releases with the plant material centers, and so they make these one set of national lists, that doesn't always get transferred for us in Texas onto the approved seeding list in those programs. And so we've been trying to work at how do we kind of instantly transition as something's new to the market so that it can be on that list and get included in those seed mix recommendations.
Go ahead. Thank you.
Well, one of the recommendations of the National Academy of Science specifically addressed CRP programs and sought to empower them to include more the use of native seeds into those programs. The CRP program and the work of the NRCS and the Plant Material Centers is focused primarily on soil conservation on agricultural lands, and if we could get them to expand more into the use of natives and accepting that those areas on farms have great value in restoration continuum, and that those lands have value beyond, as important as soil stabilization and conservation is, there are a lot of other themes that we really need those lands for. And so getting more use of native plant materials and a greater scope of greater focus on local natives and the communities that surround those farmlands, and seeing that those materials are becoming part of the equation, and that the subsidies that farmers get out of the CRP program put greater emphasis on those natives and using and planting those natives. Is that more or less?
Michael?
Oh, sorry.
So it's always interesting when we there's a bid that comes out or a request for seed, because in our foundation seed program, we'll get a whole bunch of phone calls for one thing, and coincidentally that thing is on the list. And so our challenge then becomes finding enough seed to meet that demand. And we're dealing with a lot of the same problems that seed growers end up with. In the last several, well, not several, but 4 years or something like that, we've had really dry conditions in Utah, and it has affected our foundation seed program and our foundation seed supplies. And so we do our best to try to meet the front end of that demand, and then you see the back end of that is agencies will request what varieties they know are out there already. And so that then becomes more of a, I know I can get it instead of getting what you want. And being able to work with plant material centers, I know that's been a real challenge for them to have enough funding to support the foundation seed programs. But that's another important part of it is having that seed available for the seed growers so that they can in turn supply it to the other agencies that are requesting it.
Yeah, so it's kind of a chicken or an egg dilemma, and so, we have to try and break that cycle. So we also have to be continuing to push for and recommending things beyond, the 500 species that are in development at the plant material centers. So if farmers aren't demanding it, if NRCS, county and state staff aren't recommending it, the demand's not going to grow for it. So it is kind of a chicken and egg situation, and somehow we have to break that cycle if we're going to put greater ecological value into these programs.
Yeah, and I would say in some of my discussions, I think it comes down to rethinking how those policies are structured, and this is beyond just CRP, because if we really want things that are genetically appropriate to the sites, I think the traditional model of cultivars is not necessarily well set up to support, to have the proper support structure for farmers and things like that. There's been a lot of discussion over the last couple of days about crop insurance. And I think increasing, right, and that's a very real consideration for folks that are growing, is whether this crop is insured. But the problem is I could see a win where we get some native species onto the crop insurance, but I could see an opportunity, a place where we miss an opportunity by having it be species again. And then the next time there's a fire or there's some need, we have to go through the whole farm bill process and kind of start from the beginning. So I think we need to maybe rethink, and this is again goes back to those conversations, to make sure we understand what are the barriers of entry for folks that are producing this stuff, and how do we match policies that both kind of meet that producer need, but as well as that ecological need, so that we can be more diverse and have that kind of genetic appropriateness across greater scales.
Thank you. Julie?
This makes me think a lot about scale, and I think about our restoration needs. Like, I think we have a lot of really large-scale restoration needs, and we also have a lot of small-scale restoration needs, and especially when we're thinking about restoration projects where genetics, and local, place-based is a priority. I'm wondering, and I'm thinking about Alison here, because I know that Alison, thinking about BLM funds, like there's an opportunity to fund partnerships with smaller groups who are doing things on the ground. And I met an individual yesterday who works at a community college who had got some funding to start a native plant farm or native seed farm at their community college with students, right? And I also think about the question earlier about who are we leaving out of the conversation, underserved. And we haven't talked about, opportunities to bring in the, students in college systems and public universities that are, students are coming that live there and work there, and they're going to school there, and they know that place, right? And there's an opportunity for them to learn about botany and become botanists, feed that supply chain too, and also maybe work with researchers to do science alongside it. Like, we're ticking all these boxes, right? Maybe providing seed for smaller scale, but smaller scale projects where genetics are important, educating the next generation, and doing the research at the same time. And I wonder if you all have thoughts on, it's a both and, right? Yes, the large scale restoration and the big production, but what are the opportunities for the smaller scale things? Can we have a system that supports that? Not just in one place, but like systematically supports that.
So the Nevada Native Seed Partnership, which is a collaboration that Alison and I are set on and represent different agencies within Nevada, they hold a seed forum every year. NDA hosts that. And it's intended to get producers to kind of learn more about native seeds. And there was one year where we had like two really random people, and they were like community garden people, show up. And it was the first time, and I was like, what are they doing here? And then I was like, oh my God, there are these other opportunities. So I would stress that we need to look for those kind of opportunities and be willing to kind of open up a little bit, because there are these extra opportunities that, like, me as an ecologist is like, oh, I just mapped 14 million acres. I don't think about the community gardener. So.
Yeah, and to add to that, thank you, Julie. We don't often talk about all the little grassroots projects that we're doing, because we're here and we're talking about the big stuff, and we're at the BLM and work at millions of acres. But I have a handful of nice examples where, and they're pretty small change projects, which is lovely, where it's like, here's $10,000 to build a greenhouse with your high school and work with sagebrush. Like, we have a project like that, up in McDermott, Nevada. Have you heard of it? So I don't talk about it in projects. And, or we, NDA, also part of the Nevada Native Seed Partnership, we funded them to buy seed to start a foundation seed program. The first people who applied for it was the Desert Farming Initiative from UNR, and they're, grad students, volunteers, and they're out there trying to see what happens if we plant these around our crops? Can we, does it help with the weed problem? And so we are doing a lot of those sort of grassroots projects, and I love to hear Tom say that there's grants to help people kind of come from maybe less privileged backgrounds to these kinds of meetings, because they're not represented in this group of people, but they are out there in a big way. And I think the Seed Partnership has been our primary way of finding those folks and reaching out and making more opportunities available and making it easier for them to get our money, because it's notoriously difficult to apply for our agreements, and heaven help you if you want to contract with us. It is challenging, I know, but we are doing our best, and don't want to forget about grassroots change in addition to all of this top level change that we're working on. But yeah, thank you.
Go ahead.
Florida, we don't have a seed strategy there. We don't really have any real seed partnerships. We're hoping to build something there. I hear that we have a demand issue with a lot of species, but we're fortunate enough to have a lot of public land. We have, I think, 50% of the state is in public land. It's managed by all these different agencies. I think those public lands could meet a lot of our seed demand for the time being. But one of the biggest issues I've seen so far is that different agencies are reluctant to allow for seed collecting by private contractors or even third-party organizations, because you're making money off of the land, which do you have any advice on how to overcome that kind of mentality? Or
Well, I know it has to be overcome. That's kind of what I was getting at when I was talking about procurement officers. But we have all these silos where everybody has their rules, and we need to start breaking those down pretty universally, because it's definitely getting in the way of progress. And I think some of these things, if we could tackle them actually at a national level and say, okay, this is a problem universally, rather than each of us going back to our individual state and our individual situation and trying to tackle it with individual state bureaucrats. If we could start a dialogue at the federal level and say it's a problem with federal agencies, but it's also a problem with state agencies, and and up and down the chain, and that try and come to some, more national kind of tackling the problem, rather than trying to drill down and deal with individual bureaucrats and individual agencies,
So that was one of the biggest things that was brought up by all of our seed companies back in Utah, is the issue of getting permits for collecting seed. And it's kind of like they don't want to stir the pot because it's working good in some areas and not working good in others. But they really are looking. That's one of the things that would be put down as maybe one of the biggest challenges, is that we've got to figure out a way to have a consistent permitting process for these seed collectors to go out and get seed. So it doesn't really answer the question, but yeah.
Tony?
So coming from a place of privately owned and a very strong tradition of this is mine and you are not allowed on my property for any given reason. A lot of the ways that we've been able to get around some of that is with very frank conversations. You want this material. To get that material, you have to allow us to be able to get on and do some of this. We're not being destructive. We're responsibly collecting that seed and working at educating how that process works and how that gets along, so that that end goal is being made, taking your eyes off of, hey, somebody's benefiting from this one specific thing and I'm losing out on that, to, hey, I am now benefiting this broader realization and this broader need of making native seed more available at the state level or the regional level.
I think, yeah, is it?
What was that like?
Okay, yeah, go
Is that
ahead.
all right?
Yeah, and then we'll go to somebody over here that had their hand up. Yeah.
So just to follow up as a federal employee, I think one thing you can do is, oil and gas and mining happens on all of our federal landscapes, and those people are profiting off of our lands. So I understand the personal, we're allowed to collect, fruit for personal use, but we're not allowed to collect it and then go and sell it. And I think that can easily be changed through conversation, because we already know so many people are profiting off of our lands. So I think it's just, reframing the way you talk to them. And Florida has really strong SISMAs, invasive species management cooperatives, and they do amazing work across agencies and share resources. So I think there's a nexus there that you can find.
Thank you. I think there was a question over here. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. There's a dynamic between local adaptation and those local seeds going along locally, and then there's the dynamic with agronomic production, right, where we have to produce quantity if we're going to even get close. I guess to the panelists, anybody, how do you thread that needle? And you all have different perspectives, and so I'm really curious to hear, how would you thread that needle between those two?
So our approach at Texas Native Seeds is through adaptation trials and common garden studies. We look at a large number of populations and make the selections of multiple original populations and maintain the genetics of those original populations, blend those back together post-harvest to create a multi-population germplasm release. So at that point, we have a regionally adapted, and what that region is really depends on the species. Some of them are very broadly adapted, some of them are much smaller. But in any case, there's multiple original populations originating from very local ecotypes into one broader commercial product.
Yeah, and to kind of add to Tony's points, I think also having more regional farmers, like in the Mojave, for instance, there aren't a lot of folks down in the Mojave, or even, frankly, very close to it, who can work with these plants. And even if we have growers who have capacity to try growing Mojave species, they might find it quite challenging to move it up to Washington and do that. So I think if we had more folks sort of in these regions, and then that would also help maintain these local adaptations if they stay sort of closer to their environment to a certain extent, I mean, within reason. But, in Alaska, they don't have any growers, hardly any, very few. And it's challenging because they have the same problem where you kind of need folks who are staying in that region so the seed can also stay relatively close to that region. And I think that would also help maintain some of this local adaptation we value.
So probably 99% of the seed that is collected in our program goes directly to revegetation plantings. Very little of it goes to a farmer for further increase. And these seed collectors are collecting large amounts of seed from wherever they think you want it from, and having that collaboration back and forth on where is the seed that you want. We can get into the seed zone things and they'll go out and collect it and get it, and that's a much more economic way of doing that. You'll get thousands of pounds of seed versus couple 100 pounds. And especially if it's a project that is going to happen over a number of years, and so they can go back to a ecotype that is similar and get that seed that you need.
We also need to be sure about how they're sampling when they're going out and collecting, and that they are, so oversight of the collection by private entities, I think, is really important, and we definitely said we need more funding within the federal agencies to see that there's greater oversight of collectors, because sampling is really important as well. One of the promises of having, regional programs is that, again, if you look at any of those diagrams about the supply chain, we need researchers. We need to know how long something that's been agronomically increased is still reflective of nature, of where we're putting this back out. So we need that data. So we need, in these regional partnerships, we need the participation of universities and researchers and, and generating that hard data so that we know how long a grower can keep something in production before they need to start over again. So broadly cooperative efforts at tackling this problem.
Thank you. You and then.
So on the kind of the plant materials versus local ecotype thread there, I heard of Texas Plant Materials Center guy out there talking about a little boost in the release that had 280 accessions, 280 collections, and it was finally released with 77 parent strains in there. What happens to the other 210 collections, that plant material that goes into that system? I think you're talking about research. There's reasons that maybe it wasn't selected for that, but we've already done those collections. We have that material. Is there a way to plug that into the research pipeline and find out if maybe they're better suited for other places? Since we've already done that work, you hate to see it just disappear.
So you can request that material from any of those plant material centers, and they can, depending on the seed they have and depending on your use, they can distribute it through them. Our program helps supply them with a number of those collections, and anybody, if they want to contribute to their plant material centers, can go out and make collections and collect a little bit of information and send that in. So that material is definitely there. We've worked with universities throughout the country to help source some of that material of collections that we didn't use. So that's definitely something that people can tie into.
And just on that, 77, that's great. I like that, but I'm not seeing that everywhere, hearing about that happening everywhere. So I think there's middle ground. Got it that way.
Just give me someone. We had a question in the back.
Yeah, so I'm one of those grassroots working with the
so you don't die.
Like that. But I think some of the conversations I have may be relevant for these larger things. I do some of that reframing because I find that the demand-driven thing is a bit infuriating sometimes. So one of the things I do is when people come to me and say, I want to grow a pollinator garden, rather than giving them a list of species, I might just connect them with a grower that I know is really good and say, why don't you ask them what they have, what they already have growing, and they'll hook you up. And then the other thing, I work with landscape architects and designers who are ecologically minded, and rather than asking their clients, do you want regionally appropriate native plant species? They just do that. They just give them those species anyway without even really asking. Sometimes people on the demand side just don't really know. So I wonder if those reframings are useful at your scale as well.
So I think those reframings are really important. And again, I think when we think about those things, one of the things in our work that we found was that oftentimes a lot of those conversations and a lot of those ways to process it are actually very internal. And so there would often be a lot of self-selection when it comes to that demand thing. And so one of the things that we've kind of looked at and said, I think more agencies and other folks is be very explicit when it comes to demand. So if you go to your warehouse or you go to a producer, you haven't kind of already self-selected the things that you think are going to be available. We were mentioning over here at the other table of like, well, this plant got on a list, and then all of a sudden people wanted it. One of the things that Alison has done through her program is buy some plants that currently aren't usually in the seed warehouse, and buy them and put them there, and that created a tag for them. And now people can look at it and say, oh, that's available, and maybe it's actually not in stock, but it's something that they can actually now they can be like, oh, I can order that. And so I think oftentimes what happens in a lot of these seed processes, there's a lot of internal knowledge. And I recognize that if you're a grower, if this is your business, there's incentive to not necessarily all your secrets. But I think for those of us on the management side or on kind of the agency side, we need to do a better job of making sure that these processes and the ways of thinking are actually more explicit. So people can see, this is the list that you started with, this is the list that you ended up with, and here's the 17 steps you got to before you went from, my ideal list to my realized list.
We've talked a lot in this conference about the challenges of climate change, but I've hardly heard anybody talk about it's implicit in all of it, but the biodiversity crisis that we face. And so, the promise of the system of large-scale growers, is going to be with the really common things, but getting that biodiversity into planting sites is a whole other challenge. And as I mentioned, I ran a nursery for the city of New York. We grew 500 species, which was 2/3 of the extant flora of New York City and the region. And it was very easy for the commercial growers to go out there and supply kind of the backbone of what was needed for those projects. But oftentimes, those projects would end up coming to us to fill it out. And so, some of these species are never going to be really viable for certain, growers to take on. And so, I ran a government-run nursery, and especially at the municipal level, that is a tremendous oddity. But there has to be a place for the public sector to do some of this work as well, because the commercial sector is not going to find tell me if you think I'm wrong, is not going to find many of these species economically viable to include in what they do, or figure out what you want. And get the seed in the hand of those, basically contract growing, like you're not going to make a lot of money of this, but tell me what it's going to take for you to grow, to grow this for me. And I don't care if you grow it or I grow it, that's fine with me, but somehow we've got to get the biodiversity into these plantings as well.
Just a comment on that is when we do field inspections for specific varieties, we get, or even germplasm releases, we have to match that up with the description. And if it doesn't match, it doesn't pass the field inspection. And, it can be anything from the field should be tabletop smooth to there should be a lot of variation in that variety. And one way to kind of get that description and how intense that has been is to go to the AOSCA, which is an umbrella organization for all of the seed certifying agencies, has a brochure that was recently published called the How AOSCA Tracks Wildland Source Seed. And if you go to that, there's a lot of information there on how that whole process happens.
Some questions here, yeah.
I'm coming at this from the community engagement outreach side of things as well. And I'm curious, we've heard a lot, at least I've heard a lot today, saying we need research, we need scientists, we need people to help us answer the questions we have so that we know what we need to be able to do. I'm curious if any of you have worked or where the role of community or practitioner science lies within this conversation. Otherwise, also known as citizen science. Those terms.
I just want to make the point really quickly. I haven't worked too much with a lot of my more like volunteer side, though. I was asking Beth the other day, I was like, what do we think we could do this? Anyway, but I want to say that practitioner side, I actually, in part of these conversations, is really important. We need to make sure that the folks that are actually putting the seeds in the ground in these spaces are included in this conversation about how we're going to get these things done. Owen gave a talk the other day, and I really appreciated his perspective of like, we need to include more people from the whole chain in those conversations earlier on. If we want to scale a process up, then you need to be talking to the person that's going to be actually doing it at scale. Whether that's the manufacturer of a particular piece of product or whether that's the person who's putting it on the ground. So I really want to advocate for that kind of like, we need to make sure that we're kind of running the gamut and using our ideas and sharing our ideas across those bigger spaces.
Thanks. And I think this is something we could honestly do a bit better of a job at, especially at least speaking for BLM in Nevada. But we are doing quite a lot. For instance, Friends of Nevada Wilderness, Fred actually had an agreement with them that I inherited where we were having volunteers come out and do sagebrush collections on a big scale. And it did require some changing of expectations. They're not professionals, they're volunteers, so it is different and it takes more time, but it is worth it because those are often the folks who then apply for our jobs, years down the line. We also work with through the Nevada Native Seed Partnership, we have a lot more like the conservation crews through NDF. So those are incarcerated individuals who are participating in this, and then we're trying to kind of provide them with sort of the skill set to also work in the native plant industry sort of when they get out. And then also doing a ton of just presentations. I love to present to folks. I've gone to UNR. I've, present on here's how I got my job. Here's how to navigate USA jobs because it's challenging. I went to Walker Basin Conservancy. I just sort of say, I'm a botanist, here's what I do, and it's really cool, here are all my pictures, and really just find the common language with folks. And I think it's been really meaningful for me, and I hope it's meaningful for the folks that I engage with. But it is something that I personally want to keep, building and growing.
Yeah, I just want to add that, we are caring a lot about this aspect of community science or participations of the community in the supply chain when it's possible. So in my program, we have a lot of volunteers helping us cleaning seeds. And we train them as they would be like technicians, and they really like to be, they like to learn and not just to be given a piece of a sieve and start sieving seeds, but actually going through a training that any technician would go through. And I think it's really important also to because we share the knowledge. We just not kind of use them as a workforce. But it's more like a collaborative, it becomes a collaborative activity. And I want to connect to this, something that brings back to one of the questions that I received recently about who is missing in the stakeholders that I think are missing in the dialogue or conversation. And my apologies that I forgot to say that we're trying to have a conversation with indigenous people from the region. I'm not in U.S. I'm not an American. So I'm really I feel very an outsider. So I'm trying to learn. and it's being a process, but I want to do it right, and I know that it's a learning process, but I am going to workshops, I'm going to all possible events where I can learn. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that because I forgot to say that, and it's really important. I didn't want to miss to say that, but I think, yeah, it's definitely my goal and our goal in the region to have that conversation and that input. Yeah, and that collaboration, hopefully.
Thank you. Katie, you had it?
Yeah, I was just going to say, internally, we're trying to build a community of practice because we find that a lot of folks, we have these parks scattered all over. People are very isolated, and a lot of them cannot come to meetings like this. And so to have just short, get on a phone call and share your lessons learned, because we see that a lot where people are trying to reinvent the wheel. So we're trying to build these toolkits that other people can reach out to and have those lessons learned so that they don't make the mistakes that I've made over and over again. It is very difficult to go from reading a plan or writing a restoration plan to actually putting it in action. You learn a hell of a lot when you start getting on the ground and trying to share those across the board. I think that's where I've seen people be really appreciative and happy to learn those lessons.
Ed, and then we'll go to the next question.
I would just say that every time someone takes a seed product, whether it's a plant or a bag of seed, and puts it in the ground, you're starting an experiment. And the data that you could collect from that effort is valuable. And so I think as long as citizen science, that you're being fed the techniques and that there's the assurance of the data that you're collecting, that's all very valuable. And every time you go out in your community and you're putting something in the ground, the fate of that seed and how well it's doing is really critical information. So.
Great, thank you. Did you have a question still?
Yeah.
And then I'll go to you.
We hear a lot about the demand in this meeting, and so we know that there's the demand there. And there seems to be a disconnect between scientists and producers. We're putting a lot of weight on the producers to grow this seed, but there's a lot of challenges associated with harvesting and growing it. So I was wondering, Tony had mentioned common garden studies. If you could expand on what that actually is and the metrics that y'all look at when considering different populations, not only ecologically, but for growers to produce, kind of that mindset.
So in our common garden studies, very often we've got several hundred populations that we're trying to look at. So it's walking this fine line between collecting data, good numbers, and hard data that we can run statistics on versus being able to look at all of that and not spend a master's career on an individual species. So we do visual rankings on vigor, basically how well is that plant doing, leaf density, forage production, seed production, and uniformity. We do collect actual data on stand height, survivorship, and germination. And we really weight all of that measurements and all of those visual rankings with the idea that the goal of our program is to get that product to a commercial producer and something that they can do and make money at. So uniformity is a huge one. Seed fill through germination testing is a big one. Seed production are the kind of main ones that we're looking at with those end producers in mind. And really, there's some of those things we look at and when they hit you in the face, like survivorship, and we start everything from a transplant. We can keep just about anything alive for an extended period of time as a transplant, but a lot of times that doesn't tell you anything if it doesn't produce seed or it's just not doing very well. So that's kind of how we go about that process, this kind of in-between, get through it quick and look as much as we can to pick the top tier worth of populations without getting bogged down in a lot of the really detailed science.
In the back?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the point of biodiversity, and I feel, as traps compared to many different ways within the native plant materials industry, we play such a role in species selection. And so therefore, what we return to the landscape is also affecting the composition of plant communities. And I'm just curious, it was spoken about contract grow-outs and such, but where is the opportunity, particularly with thinking of the native seed supply chain, to think about risk, not only and funding risks, not only in the sense of funding new farmers to the industry, but also those species that might not heavily produce, but we don't necessarily know the impact of the loss of that. And I don't just mean those listed species, but also just what we don't see performing in landscape in the same way. So folks can just speak to examples or opportunities.
Thank you. I love that question. So, yeah, because it kind of also gets at, we always focus, we call them workhorse species, where, we have our short list of we know these perform well in ag lands, and growers know how to work with them, and those are the ones we request in really, really great quantities. But then there's these so-called boutique species that aren't really, they don't cooperate, they don't flower and produce seed in their first year, all of those things. And we've really been sort of more heavily relying on agreements with NGOs, universities, things like that. And those are the folks who are more willing to sort of play with it. And in an agreement sort of structure, at least with the BLM, there's not that contracted output, so you're not required to sort of, we give you X dollars, you will give us X pounds of seed at the end of the day. It's more like the final deliverable is your best effort and your best ability to sort of what did you learn from this, and it becomes more of a science experiment to work with these boutique species. What becomes challenging is we still need a certain number of pounds of those boutique species, but it's a place to start. So it goes from, maybe contracting, so kind of the contracting world, it works a lot better with those workhorse species that we know a lot about, but those more boutique species that are really challenging, they kind of work better in the NGO university space, and that's speaking for myself. But you're sitting next to our contracting officer, so he can tell you more.
Beth?
Yeah, this is in the comment category. Thinking about science and the scientific research and what its value, and are we going to wait for it, or are we just going to go ahead? There's another value of science that I really see from my perspective, which is it also trains these people. You can't go from high school into one of these jobs, and the process of going to college and doing a master's and doing a PhD, which might seem like wasting time, or that process creates the workforce that is needed for these things. And Fred Edwards, really, I appreciate Fred got it. He will fund any nerdy thing, right? Because it creates a human with a great background of skills and ideas who can then go on to do management. But you cannot get those people without the science. And so there's two benefits. You get the information from the science, and you get the scientists, right? And so you cannot just go pull people off the bus and have them do the jobs that you guys are doing. We need to train them. So plug for education right now.
Absolutely. And I, as somebody that came out of programs that were applied and apprenticeship-based, I couldn't speak more highly of hands-on training opportunities that are also science-based, so you're getting both. So you could speak, the language of practitioners, but also, have an understanding from a scientific background. So you, and then Julie.
So Kay this morning mentioned showing that National Academy sends support to leaders, and I think, I'm not sure if this is a missing group in the conversation, but I haven't heard anyone mention directors of state agencies, policymakers, state legislators, people who set agendas and work on state budgets. How are you all in your various states contacting, connecting with these people? What is your message, and how is it being received?
So one of the things working for the Nature Conservancy that I often tell people is hey, what are the things that you want to tell to your boss, but you cannot tell to your boss? right? Because we often can be, so I think, and my point of that is, I think this is where you need to talk with your colleagues, and every organization has its hierarchies, you know, and if you think about, if you're a parent and you think about, if I tell my child something, he's not going to listen. But if you tell my child something, he's going to think you're the coolest person ever, right? And so sometimes I think we need to do a better job of sharing what our real needs are among ourselves and making sure that we're what do they call it, up managing or down, helping others to up manage and down manage. I think the other thing is we need to be careful about our message. I was in some conversations when we were trying to put this all together. And I was like, you just told me that you had enough seed, but didn't have enough seed. And they were like, yeah, I know. I was like, and that's the problem, because that message gets put up to higher people. And if we can't articulate what that is really well, you know, oftentimes these people have a million different things that they're trying to consider. And so if they're like, they don't know that they really got it or whatever, that can really be an issue in making sure that message is clear. I was really excited with all the plenary speakers that we had to see that these are folks that are making decisions and engaged. And so I think that's a lot of testament to all the folks that are here and have been pushing for this stuff, because I do think that conversation is changing, but I do think it's a continual thing that we need to do in that communication space to make sure that we are communicating the right messages to all levels. And because it's not just the top, oftentimes they need to hear it from the community in order for those decisions to get made.
Are you doing
that? I do it as much as I can. So, and I've been on emails with my government relations people, because, you know, frankly, you probably don't want me in the room with a politician, like, for a big chunk of time. So we go through, and again, this is a little different from being a nonprofit, that we can go through our external affairs folks to kind of help us craft those messages. One of the things that the Nevada Native Seed Partnership has done is created this communication subgroup. And so for much of this, it's a lot of the technical people that it's participants. But in that particular one, we've brought in the, what do you call the information? The PR. We call them PR, but the government people always call them yes, public information, PIOs. And so one of the things that we've done there is try to, as opposed to all of us kind of creating something new that kind of adds to that, we just are like, hey, if you have a story that you push on social media or something like that, send it to all of us, and then we all push it out. So having those collaboratives and those seed partnerships, I actually think is really important from the technical piece, but it's equally as important from the communication piece. And I'm glad that when we were forming that group, we had the foresight to say, you know, we don't really know how to do this. Let's find the people that do know how to do this. And I think this is, again, we're making sure you're thinking about who are the engineers that need to be in the room, and who are the growers that need to be in the room, who are the communication peoples that need to be in the room. Because again, if you put me in a room with a politician, I'm going to bore them eventually.
Fred? Sure.
So that's why we created the Nevada Seed Partnership. Started with that. We're like, okay, we need to engage and have this conversation with the state agency and their leadership, as we were having it with our leadership. And so, yeah, everything, it's engineered. So, yeah.
I just want to add something about the Southeast. Hopefully, we're starting with the right foot, with the right step, this program, because just to keep everyone in the loop about this question, I want to answer about the region. I think there is a really great conversation going on with all the regional botanists of Fish and Wildlife Service in our region. So, for example, the central office, who is actually funding our program, gave us contact to all the other the regional officers. So we're trying to keep everyone in the loop. Also asking, for example, we're just starting in the region with the Seeds of Success collections. So asking help about helping us with the species list. So what's the regional need? What's the regional perspective, or at the state level or eco-regional level? And so we're trying to keep everyone in the loop. And this is just an example, SOS, and Fish and Wildlife Service, but the idea is that we will be kind of like mediators of or coordinators of these regional conversations. So again, there is no over-collection or duplication of efforts. Everyone is looped in, and so we can all collaborate and not duplicate.
Thanks. Time for one more question. No, you good? What's that?
I don't know that I have that good of a question.
Sure, Fred.
I do. To respond to Ed, he said there's a boatload of money out there, right? Bill and IRA. It's out there. Guess what? The door is closing, and it's almost closed really, really, really fast. And in fact, I can't speak for other agencies, but on the BLM side, those decisions are being made for IRA right now. Those decisions for Bill have primarily already been made and programmed in. I've heard from Park Service that a lot of their decision-making for seeds has already been allocated. That said, that's the reality of where we're at. Your voice matters still. There is all of this money from the BLM perspective is coming out as project dollars. There's not a whole lot of this conversation thinking about the supply chain going on, because it's so driven by get the money on the ground, get it through projects. So as you talk to people, this is a really critical conversation to have. And so let people know, let your lawmakers, your decision makers, this is being driven, I think, a lot by the administration to show progress in Congress as well. But it's like a snake. With this big lump of money, it takes a while to digest.
Great. Thank you.
I can't lobby. Just making that clear.
Who makes the decisions? Like, who do I suggest?
Well, I just wanted to give you a huge thanks, and a huge thanks to our panel for answering lots of really complicated questions and really diving in deeper than I think, kind of the surface level or the big picture, which I really appreciate. I encourage folks to stay in touch. I'm going to do a couple of shameless plugs. International Network for Seed-Based Restoration. We said that we need more collaboration, more conversations, more connections between scientists, practitioners, stakeholders. It's a great avenue for that. So check us out. Also, if you work in the sagebrush steppe ecosystem, the Nature Conservancy's program really targets restoration and improving restoration outcomes and conservation of that system. So if you have questions, if you work in that system, please chat with us. And finally, hopefully you won't kill me for this, but if you guys want to reach out to our panelists with additional questions that I didn't cover or things that come up later, we have the HUA app, which tracks everybody's email info, so please do that. And with that, thank you so much. Give a round of applause.